Well, g'day and welcome. It's great to have your company. Well, it's morning in America following the election of Donald Trump and voters' emphatic repudiation of the woke political agenda that's at the heart of the West's economic and social decline. Can America seize the moment and become great again? Will Australian politicians, particularly in the coalition, have the courage to now push back on net zero and the radical trans agenda and so many other crazy ideas of the left which are doing so much harm? Speaking of net zero, Gerard Holland from the Page Research Centre will join me to explain why nuclear energy is by far cheaper than so-called renewables. In a speech at last month's ARC conference in Sydney, he made Chris Bowen look an even bigger fool. You won't want to miss my chat with Gerard coming up in just a moment. As usual, Kirralie Smith from Binary joins me and we'll look at how Kamala Harris and Tim Walz failed to sell the idea that men could be women. It was a real voter turn-off. Is this the end of the line for the radical LGBTIQA+ political movement? Also, today is Remembrance Day, when at the 11th hour, on the 11th day of the 11th month, the guns fell silent on the Western Front after 4 years of bloody war. Lest we forget. Well, America and the West have been given a reprieve from so-called progressive politics which have dominated in recent years. With their power threatened, elites in the media, academia, politics and the corporate world reacted with hysteria to the possibility of Donald Trump's return to the White House. Ridiculous Hitler slurs and scares about the end of democracy, coupled with Kamala Harris's most prominent policy pitch, wait for it, abortion to birth, none of that worked. She was still banging on about abortion in her concession speech, despite its failure to attract voters. She even lost white women. They all voted for Trump, despite Trump having a women's problem, supposedly. Trump, of course, is not perfect and he makes mistakes. We all do. The level of vitriol, though, seen through politically weaponised judiciary, radically biased media and 2 assassination attempts has been absolutely unhinged. Let's hope it stops now, now that he's been re-elected and that he has given the chance to enact the policy agenda that Americans overwhelmingly voted for. Sacred cows of the globalist progressive left, including those held dear by elites in Australia's Labor, Greens and Liberal parties, have been repudiated. Telling children their gender is fluid will be booted from schools and the economy will be unshackled from cost of living destroying net zero initiatives following Donald Trump's emphatic return to the presidency. The so-called progressive political project that has plunged the West, including Australia, into decline has suffered a major setback. Trump's drill baby drill policy will unleash America's abundant oil and gas reserves, making energy and therefore the cost of everything cheaper. Trump will withdraw from the Paris net zero agreement. That will bring down the cost of electricity. Australia should do the same, but sadly both Liberal and Labor are digging in, preferring to stay in the globalist net zero fantasy club. As recently as yesterday, Peter Dutton was committed to that. Families struggling to make ends will begin to prosper again if energy is made affordable again. We'll see that in America. Hopefully it'll overflow to Australia. Trump's proposed cuts to regulations and corporate tax will stimulate economic growth. This is all just common sense. The southern border will be secured following the illegal entry of around 15 million unvetted people. Joe Biden and Kamala Harris were punished for not attending to the basics. This should be a warning to Australia's political elites. Harris and Biden pursued progressive ideology instead, which resulted in high inflation, high debt, illegal immigration, men and women's sports, and abortion to birth. Radical political correctness, which stifles freedom of speech and religion, will be banned under Trump. And with J.D. Vance warning that European nations with defence ties to the US, well, those ties could be threatened if they don't support freedom of speech. There's a warning there for the Albanese government, which wants to censor Elon Musk and censor us online. After having the proverbial kitchen sink thrown at him by a politically weaponised Justice Department and having been repeatedly labelled fascist and his supporters garbage, Trump survived those 2 assassination attempts to reclaim the presidency after a loss that was tainted by all sorts of election fraud and goings-on in 2020. No one seriously believes that Biden got 81 million votes in 2020, but that's another story. It's the most extraordinary political comeback since the much maligned Winston Churchill, who suffered in the political wilderness during the 1930s before successfully leading Great Britain through its darkest hour. Cometh the man, cometh the hour. As well as toxic gender fluid ideology, Trump has vowed to get critical race theory the hell out of our schools. Kids will be taught to be proud of America again. Imagine if we could do this in Australia instead of the annual Australia Day round of self-loathing and our kids being taught that our country is a tainted colonial oppressor. After the Democrats and the deep state tried everything to destabilise Trump's first presidency with a fake Russia investigation and impeachments, a battle-hardened Trump will be more productive this time. Former Democrat Elon Musk's purchase of the social media platform Twitter, which he renamed X, kept free speech alive. We can't underestimate the role that Musk played in stopping the tech giants from putting their thumbs on the scale of information. That is a huge contribution to this electoral cycle. Musk's contribution and that of Robert F. Kennedy, his endorsement, again, the former Democrat member of the Democrat royal family, the Kennedys, that endorsement should also not be underestimated as well. Australian politics needs these sort of big rocks to be thrown into the pond as well. Now, unlike the 2020 election, the tech giants and the mainstream media were unable to control the information flow by suppressing critical stories like the Hunter Biden laptop story, which undoubtedly influenced the outcome. It was a much freer and fair election this time around. Trump is certainly a flawed vessel, and his narcissism and his American brashness, well, that can grate. But he has courage in spades, staring down vitriolic opposition from the political and media elites, and not to mention those 2 assassination attempts, well, a third if you count the Iranians and their plot to try and kill him as well, which was uncovered by the FBI. Now remember, Trump was initially opposed vigorously by his own Republican Party. They didn't want him the first time round, and they certainly didn't want him the second time round. The same forces Trump overcame in the Republican Party are the ones that still control Australia's coalition parties. Now, the question for Australia is this: is there anyone willing to push back on the status quo in the way that Trump has? A few coalition backbenchers, like the courageous Queensland Senator Matt Canavan, have, but they seem to be voices in the wilderness. It doesn't seem to move Peter Dutton, doesn't seem to move the party room. Australia's political establishment is entrenched, and the coalition seems to be unwilling to be bold, except, and to their credit, on nuclear energy, which is a promising sign, but of course it's nowhere near enough. As I said, the Liberal Party have confirmed over the weekend that they want to remain in the Paris Accord, despite Trump saying he's going to pull America out of it. It's pointless for us to stay there. If America's not there, of course China and India take no notice of it and they're emitting it. The whole thing is a farce. The targets cannot be met. And all it is doing is hurting the poor. Australia's political leaders actively support or acquiesce through their silence to social policies like gender fluid ideologies, claim on children, and the left's anti-free speech agenda that has enforced this through a chilling regime of anti-discrimination and anti-vilification laws. Both sides of politics are on board, as I say, with the net zero, except for the coalition's nuclear agenda, and that is a green shoot, of course. The coalition's policy still allows windmills and solar farms to be rolled out unnecessarily, blighting the landscape and adding to household power bills. The US has been spared another 4 disastrous years of Democrat policies carrying the agenda of these progressive elites. This will provide cover for Australian politicians who are willing to rush the guards of progressive orthodoxy which exist in the Labor, Liberal and Greens political establishment. The next 4 years provide an opportunity for Australian political leaders to drain the billabong. Only a lack of courage stands in the way. Well, the Albanese government is rushing Australia to a transition of its electricity supply from cheap and reliable coal and gas to insanely expensive, unreliable and environmentally destructive industrial windmills and solar factories. The government's target is to have 80% of Australia's electricity generation coming from renewables by 2030. That's in just over 5 years' time. And this is in order to meet net zero carbon dioxide targets that have been set by the globalist Paris Accord. Now, Gerard Holland is the CEO of the National Party's think tank, the Page Research Centre. He delivered a speech at last month's Alliance for Responsible Citizenship conference in Sydney, which destroyed the idea peddled by politicians that renewables are cheap and reliable. Gerard Holland joins me now. Gerard, thanks so much for your time. Before we get into the cost of renewables versus coal, gas and nuclear energy, take us through your analysis of where we are now on the trajectory to net zero and the yawning gap that you and others have identified in our power generation capacity.
Thanks so much for having me, Lyle. It's great to be with you. I think the important thing as a starting point is the kind of questions that you ask will in lots of ways dictate the kind of answers that you'll get out on the back end. It's a trivial example, but if I was to ask, how do we eliminate all road fatalities tomorrow? Well, the simplest way would be to ban cars. Now, obviously, this would have huge consequences downstream. How do we get around? What would it mean for the economy? How could society function? But this is actually the exact process that we've gone about when we asked, how do we eliminate carbon dioxide emissions at the point of generation as quick as we possibly can without any considerations to the trade-offs around reliability, around cost, around land use and environmental damage, and around our national security. And this was really the kind of angle that I wanted to take going in, was asking a more nuanced question of how do we produce electricity that is as cheap as possible, as reliable as possible, as secure as possible, while still maintaining our fundamental responsibility to steward the natural environment. And to that first point that you mentioned around reliability and that base load, I have really quite serious concerns around the trajectory that we're on. The fact is that as we begin to decommission our coal-fired power plants, we've already seen a couple of those decommissioned over the last couple of years, and we've got Eraring coming up very soon. We're going to see a huge gap in our capacity to provide base load, steady 24-hour electricity to the grid. Now, we've put a lot more renewable capacity into the grid, this is true, but this is peaking power. This is power that doesn't follow demand. This is power that is produced predominantly during the day when actually demand can be quite low, and doesn't have any accountability for how we keep our lights on during the night in those 24-hour industries or even our hospitals, refrigeration and all those other kind of manufacturing goods. And
Yes. So Gerard, we just got on our screen there a graph that you presented during your talk at ARC, which I thought was very powerful, which shows this yawning gap. It shows those coal-fired power stations coming offline and essentially Australia's electricity generation falling off a cliff. Are we in danger of having the lights go out?
Yeah, so this is a really important graph that was prepared by Professor Stephen Wilson. And as you can see, there is no extra baseload power coming on. And this graph could equally be titled, "There Be Blackouts." The fact is, you can't afford to turn anything off until you're ready to turn a like-for-like technology on. And in the case of coal-fired power plants, it's either gas turbines, which will never be cost competitive with coal, or nuclear power, which is the kind of trajectory that I would advocate we should be following into the future.
Absolutely. So Gerard, presumably people in Chris Bowen's office know this. Why are we still hurtling headlong down this path?
So I've grappled with this quite a lot myself, and you sort of come to two conclusions. Neither of them are particularly kind to our energy minister. And the first one is it is ignorance, and that he's over his brief, and that he does need to take a lot more time to sit down, look at the full system cost, and actually analyse, well, how many batteries would we need? How do we keep these batteries charged? What happens if we have several days of low solar or wind output? When you start asking these questions, you come to some quite frightening conclusions. The other
Gerard,
conclusion I come to is he doesn't know the brief, but he...
Sorry, Gerard, let's go to those conclusions then, because you put up another graph which you qualified as a back-of-the-envelope calculation, but it's informed. And you compared the costs of renewables and the trajectory that Chris Bowen's got us going on now, and you compared that with renewables alone, renewables plus gas to sort of help with the peaking, and then nuclear and coal. What did you find?
Well, I came to some quite staggering numbers that once you actually look at the full systems cost, everything from building to operating to fuel to decommissioning and then to replacements over a generation. So I've looked at 60 years, which is the lower bound of the age of a nuclear power plant. You come to some quite revealing numbers. For a fully renewable grid over the next 60 years, you're looking at around $2.57 trillion. Now, this is $95,000 per Australian. It's a staggering number. And of course, we haven't factored in discounting into these calculations, but it equally applies for coal or for nuclear. And so all of the numbers are directionally in the same place. Over the same time period, you'd replace coal-fired power plants twice, but you would never have to replace your nuclear reactor during that time. Nuclear reactors last 60 to 80 years, and there's some amazing innovations coming out of particularly South Korea where they can extend the life up to 100 years. And so once you're looking at the full generation and an entire lifespan of Australians investing into the future, you really come to a quite obvious conclusion as to which direction we should be heading in. And once you factor in how much do the batteries cost? How many times do we have to replace them? How do we have to decentralise the grid and build out more transmission lines? And how much extra storage and extra generating capacity do we need to get through wind droughts, to get through the middle of winter when we have low sun? That's when you start coming to those enormous numbers.
So those numbers, that's quite telling. Again, it's an analysis that probably needs to be costed forensically by economists and the like, but nonetheless, those figures are out there for debate. It clearly shows if we want to get to net zero, we can do so far cheaper with nuclear. If we didn't want to get to net zero, we could do it very cheaply with coal, but the nuclear isn't that much more expensive. It seems like a no-brainer. Why, again, do policymakers not see this?
So I think actually I was quite surprised by these numbers. I've always just accepted that coal was the cheapest. We have a lot of coal here. We can produce coal-fired power plants quite cheaply. That how competitive nuclear reactors were. And these are the numbers based on existing plants and reactors such as the Baraka in the UAE. But once you factor in the 20,000 modifications that were made to adapt these reactors for a quite harsh environment that we wouldn't require in Australia with the sites that Peter Dutton has identified, I'm convinced you could do nuclear even cheaper here if you set about a sensible and appropriate pathway. Well, there's a couple of reasons why we don't know this. And the first one is when AEMO designs their plan, they've been given the directive to achieve net zero and to achieve net zero by arbitrary deadlines, a certain amount of decarbonisation by 2030 and a certain amount of decarbonisation by 2050. So that instantly takes coal off the table unless you use excessively expensive carbon capture, storage and offsetting. It takes nuclear off the table because obviously we have a moratorium on nuclear here at the moment. And so there is that load time in legalising nuclear and building those reactors. But once you remove these arbitrary deadlines and think more broadly about how we design the grid, you come to very different conclusions to what AEMO and GenCost have presented.
Yeah, well, once you put common sense on the table, you come to those conclusions. You also showed another graph, which I thought was quite frightening, which, based on the trajectory we're going, this graph of Australia, or this map of Australia, shows where the industrial solar farms and windmills have to go, and the sort of landmass that's got to be covered to produce this renewable transition. This is not exactly environmentally friendly, is it?
Well, my frustration is we're destroying our natural environment in order to appease this ideological affinity with renewable energy. The promise with renewables is that it's cleaner, but the fact is once you factor in all the steel, the concrete that goes into building them, or the rare earth refinery and mining that oftentimes happens offshore, you're only reducing your emissions by 40%. At the same time, because these are such diffuse methods of extracting energy from the environment as opposed to the dense sources of energy such as coal or nuclear, you need an enormous amount of land use, which means that you actually do degrade your environment to quite a serious degree. This is our farmland, this is our national parks, when you've got all these wind turbines being built across our mountain ranges. And the sheer scale of decarbonising Australia is unfathomable. And the graph that you're referring to was prepared by the Net Zero Steering Group last year, which was released to really no real fanfare. I feel quite buried by the media, but I think it's really important that Australians understand this is how you actually begin to produce these kind of industrial installations in order to meet our quite modest demand of electricity, if we're being honest.
Yeah, no, it's extraordinary. I think if people knew this, they'd be rethinking this. Talk about issues being buried by the media. There were journalists in the room at the ARC conference here in Sydney last month. They chose to focus on other issues that had nothing to do with what was being discussed at ARC. That's very frustrating because, you know, this is the biggest economic change that we are seeing probably in the post-war era in Australia, and yet they chose to ignore this and ask Jacinta Nampijinpa-Price about the issue of abortion. That's an important issue, but that wasn't on the agenda at ARC. This was, and they ignored this. How can we get good public policy to take up John Anderson's famous phrase, from a really bad debate?
Well, I think we need to keep contributing to this debate, and this was one of the reasons that ARC was so exciting. Was ARC didn't tend to wade into the day-to-day media cycle of mud fighting and politicisation, and really did try to take a step back and look at what direction are we heading in as a country? What are the civilizational issues that are going to shape and define us as a nation? Going all the way back to what is our national story? Who are we as a country and as a people? Are we telling that well? To the energy transition, as we've been discussing. But I think the most important takeaway from ARC was really marrying together that good social policy and good economic policy, they're not divorced from each other. And actually, you need a really healthy and robust social fabric in order to have a healthy and thriving economy, and vice versa. And if we can begin to inject some of that understanding and nuance into the public debate, we will expect that over time we'll get better leaders who are better informed and begin to make better decisions for our country. Yeah,
I couldn't agree more, Gerard. I think ARC is very much the hope of the side, but we also need an honest media that will report the debate and the discourse that ARC is seeking to change. And the sort of contribution you're making, I think, has got us well on the way. We just need some honest reporting. Gerard Holland, thank you so much for your time and for unpacking all that. I'd encourage people to go to the ARC YouTube channel, Google Gerard Holland and ARC and energy, and you'll find Gerard's excellent 14-minute talk there. It's well worth watching. Thanks again, Gerard.
Lyle, thanks so much for your time, and to the point about informed media, this is exactly what you're doing, and thank you for all you're doing at ADH.
It's a privilege to be doing it. Thanks again. Well, unborn babies at risk of abortion and women with unsupported pregnancies now have no voice in the Liberal and National parties. Those who want to advocate publicly have been gagged after Peter Dutton last week banned MPs and senators from talking about human rights for unborn babies. According to leaks from the party room, later verified by a coalition spokesperson, the issue of abortion lost votes at the Queensland election, and therefore even advocating care for babies born alive after abortion is now banned. I think that's a dubious analysis by the coalition hardheads. Now, this is, as I say, it's debatable, and it's clear that Kamala Harris lost her bid for the US presidency despite making abortion to birth her signature women's policy. In fact, it was pretty much the only policy that she put forward during the election campaign, apart from Donald Trump is evil and we need abortion. I was amazed at how high profile that issue was, but it didn't win her vote. She even lost white women who voted for Trump more than for her. Now, the issue of abortion is not the kryptonite that the bedwetters in the coalition think it is. People can be persuaded, particularly on the issue of late-term abortion. Peter Dutton's edict means his members are no longer free to advocate for the Born Alive bill, which Senators Alex Antic, Matt Canavan and Senator Ralph Babet have been pushing. This is proposed legislation to ensure babies who survive the abortion attempt on their lives, about one per week in Australia, are given medical care instead of just being left to die, as is the current practice. It's a grisly business, the abortion business, sadly. There are indications Senator Canavan may partially defy Peter Dutton and push the bill regardless, but he has, again sadly, agreed with Dutton that abortion won't be an issue at the upcoming federal election. At least that's what the media has reported him as saying. Now, Dutton is either ignorant or is unmoved by the tears of the whistleblower midwife Louise Adset, who told a Queensland parliamentary inquiry of multiple cases of late-term babies surviving their abortion, gasping for breath for hours before they died.
This is not an uncommon occurrence. Just recently, a mother decided to abort her baby at 19 weeks. The same misoprostol regime was started, and this little baby was born alive again, moving, gasping for air, and having a palpable heart rate, and once again, over 400 grams.
Now, as I said before, the Coalition wrongly, in my view, believes that the LNP lost votes at the Queensland election as Labor ran a scare campaign which conveniently ignored the issue of late-term abortion, which polling shows is opposed by most Queenslanders. That's YouGov Polling, a very respectable polling company. But the media never talk about that. Instead of seeking to persuade Queenslanders of the brutality of Labor's abortion to birth laws, the leader, David Crisafulli, now Premier, imposed a clumsy gag on his MPs and candidates, and that meant the issue became a dominant issue in the lead up to the election. Now, Dutton is making the same silly mistake. No parliamentarian or party member should be forced to support abortion, particularly late-term abortion, but it appears the Coalition is now on a unity ticket with the Greens and Labor in trashing the human rights of our most vulnerable. This is a seismic shift for the Coalition, whose Conservative members have been proactively recruiting pro-life Christians and Conservatives all over the country on the promise that they could make headway within the Liberal and National parties for the pro-life cause. Well, Dutton just hit that on the head. The 9 newspapers which broke the story reported a rare party room leak. And I quote from the 9 newspapers. One MP who spoke on the condition of anonymity said Dutton told the joint party room that the issue was largely not a federal one and the debate had been done and dusted in the past. We will not be changing our position. It cost us votes in Queensland, in metropolitan seats in particular. The reaction from women was visceral. The MP recalled Dutton saying, "It's fair to say he laid down the law. There will be no change to abortion laws." And he reminded us that we all need to be disciplined. The Australian Financial Review also confirmed the leak, reporting the following comments from a Coalition spokesperson. He, Dutton, made the point that while it was an issue in the state election, it was not something that we could address in the federal parliament. And so attempts by Labor to draw us off in that area should be seen as exactly what they are, a distraction, end quote. Now, this last point is, of course, a lie. It is the federal government that forces even pro-life Australians who have a conscientious objection to abortion, forces us to fund abortion through our Medicare levies. And it's the federal government that regulates the human pesticide RU486, the abortion drug, which is now the most common method for killing babies using that chemical substance. 5% of women who take the abortion drug suffer complications, some of which are life-threatening. Again, the media don't talk about this. It's unspeakably sad that the Coalition views the killing of unborn babies and the coercion of women by so many men to kill their babies as a distraction. The issue flared after a journalist asked Northern Territory Senator Jacinta Nampijinpa-Price for her views on abortion. She said this, and I quote, "Late term is anywhere past the first trimester as far as I'm concerned. Full term becomes infanticide, and I cannot agree with that," Senator Price said. Good on her. She, of course, is right. We have abortion all the way to birth in this country, and for Peter Dutton to say that his senators and members can't talk about that is unconscionable. Now, for this truth bomb, Nampijinpa-Price was slapped down by the Deputy Liberal leader, Susan Ley. The abortion extremists in the Albanese government also seized on Dutton's edict, with the Women's Minister, Katie Gallagher, calling on pro-life senators Matt Canavan and Alex Antic to drop their Human Rights, Children Born Alive Protection Bill 2022, which would require medical practitioners to provide treatment to babies born alive as a result of the abortion attempts on their lives. Now, despite overwhelming medical evidence and first-hand testimony from midwives like ADSET that babies are routinely surviving late-term abortions and being left to die, Gallagher wants the Born Alive bill buried. She says it is dangerous, but the only danger is that it risks turning public opinion against the grisly abortion industry, which Labor, the Greens and now the Coalition are running a protection racket for. Sadly, Antic and Canavan went to ground as the media pursued them in the wake of last week's party room meeting. Only Canavan has spoken to say he would not withdraw the Born Alive bill, and good on him for that. But sadly, he did say that he would support Dutton's call for the issue to be left out of the federal election campaign. Sadly, it appears the Coalition has crossed a Rubicon and thrown in the towel on the issue of human rights for unborn babies. Well, it's time for our regular gender reveal segment with Kirralie Smith from Binary Australia. Kirralie, welcome. Kirralie, Donald Trump has romped it back into the White House on the promise of getting gender ideology. Well, let's hear it from him himself.
And we will not have men playing in women's sports. That will end immediately.
Well, that's the promise, and he's reaffirmed that this week with his transition team. Kirralie, we know that Albo won't move on this. He's too woke. Do you think Peter Dutton will have the courage to take it up?
Well, look, I think it's up to all of us now to make sure that we're contacting all of our local politicians, our representatives, and particularly the leadership team around Peter Dutton and Peter Dutton himself, and just constantly remind them that this was a key election issue in the US. Trump was very consistent in bringing it out. Every single rally that he spoke at, there were campaign ads that focused on this. His team around him were consistent. And so it really is a no-brainer. Like, the Australian politicians only have to address 2 or 3 issues in this country, that being one of them, and they will definitely defeat Labor and the woke Teals and Greens and everyone else who is about this absurd nonsense that someone can change their sex or that men should have the right to dominate women in their spaces, services and sports.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Kirralie. The timidity of the Coalition, their sort of political, the sort of accepted view amongst the Coalition is that, don't fight the culture wars. That's what the Brains Trust tell the Conservative people within the Coalition all the time. Yet Kamala Harris and Tim Walz, they were right out there on this stuff. Tim Walz, famously put tampons in the toilets of boys in their schools, and this crazy graphic was put up to illustrate that point. It did the rounds in the campaign. And Kamala Harris, of course, was famous for saying she believed that the government should pay for sex change operations for male prisoners who wanted to become female. So it was right there. Trump took it on and he won. There's a lesson here for the Coalition, isn't there?
Oh, absolutely. And he won convincingly. This was not a narrow lead or a narrow victory. This was a resounding victory. And the Americans spoke, and I believe the Australian people would also speak. We've seen already the murmurings around the misinformation, disinformation bill. People are very upset about it. Thousands of submissions were made to the inquiry, ignored by Labor. Now, if the Coalition also ignore what Australians are saying, that we want to speak freely and plainly and truthfully about biological sex, then they're going to be punished for it. They might succeed in overcoming Labor initially, but it won't remain that way. They need to take a stand, and they need to do it very soon.
They absolutely do. It looks like that misinformation, disinformation bill might be held up in the Senate, which would be great. But just before we leave the US, people will also remember Biden's pick as health secretary, the biological man, Rachel Levine. And I've got a picture of him, which we'll put up on the screen, with the White House press secretary, White House press spokesperson, Karine Jean-Pierre, the black lesbian. She's very proud of her identity. People won't be sad to see the back of these sort of people now that the Biden administration has been swept away. Is this sort of like a metaphor for perhaps, this woke LGBTIQA plus agenda being consigned to the dustbin of history, do you think?
Look, it's getting closer and closer every day. Every time Rachel Levine was, paraded out in public or his photo was shown, it was just a major exercise in gaslighting, but it also worked to pique and wake up a lot of people to the nonsense that this ideology wants us to accept that man as a woman, and particularly in his health portfolio was just an utter joke. So I think people are waking up. The more they put it in our faces, the more we realise this is nonsense. It's offensive and it's dangerous for women and children. So let's hope that, he'll get the boot. Let's hope that as the Greens, the Teals and the Labor Party in Australia, if they try something like this on, they're going to go down even harder than what is predicted at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. And people in Australia have got to realise that while Americans have repudiated all this nonsense, we still remain in the grip of this political correctness. We've got people like Sal Grover in court, yourself, myself, and we've got a timid Liberal Party which won't take it on. So let's hope there's some courage and some spine stiffened as a result of these people being losing their jobs in the US. Kirralie, you highlighted this week on the Binary blog another big story in the gender space that broke. Viewers will remember the male Algerian boxer Iman Khalif, who punched down on women at the Paris Olympics to win a gold medal. What's the latest development in terms of his status as a biological man?
Look, a leaked report confirmed what we already know, that he has XY chromosomes, that he is male, he's got internal testes, no womb. Everything about him is male. He may have had a few question marks over female characteristics, but once he reached puberty, it was more than confirmed that he is male. And the IOC are doing nothing about taking off his medal from him. We all could see it. We all knew that he was male. We all knew that, again, the gaslighting going on, having him punch women violently in the face in the name of sport for the whole world to see was an act in wokeness that was off the charts. But this has now been confirmed. He is male beyond any shadow of a doubt. And there's no consequences at this stage. It's really horrendous. The only consequence is that more and more people, again, are waking up and being outraged that a man is allowed to punch women in the name of sport.
Yeah, well, good on you for highlighting that on the Binary blog, and people can go there for the latest of what's happening in this gender space. A good week for the cause, Kirralie, but I think, as you and I know, there's a long way to go, and courage is going to be the ingredient that will determine whether what's happened in the US translates here into Australia. Kirralie, keep up the fight. Thanks again for your time.
Thank you so much for having me, Lyle.
Well, just before I go, some further evidence that the Trump factor is already having a positive effect on Australia, and that perhaps, just perhaps, we've hit peak woke. Last night, I landed in Sydney on a flight from Adelaide. I took several flights last week as I was travelling for work, and each of them ended with the cabin crew going through the motions of the acknowledgement of country, as if those of us on the plane did not have the same right as some of others in this nation. Well, when we landed in Sydney at about 9 p.m. last night, for the first time in many years, Qantas did not perform the acknowledgement of the land, skies and the waterways upon which we whatever, blah, blah, blah. Now, I've come to dread this meaningless and divisive ritual, and it was a breath of fresh air not to have to endure it, as I say, for the first time in years. Now, please hear me. I have nothing against our Indigenous brothers and sisters and only want the best for them. But every aircraft landing is not the place to be inflicting a certain view of history upon the passengers. Americans have said they are sick of woke virtual signalling. Let's hope Australians can also rise up against our political elites and say enough is enough. The fact that one of our wokest corporations, Qantas, just might be reading the room is a sign that things have perhaps shifted. Well, thanks again for your company. Don't forget to follow me on X at Lyle Shelton and make ADH TV your home of woke-free and uncensored viewing. Until next week, keep pushing back and keep speaking up.